Yeah, I learned my right from wrong on a song. I let my heart bleed on my sleeve through microphones. I'm trying to right my wrongs. Promise I do. I ain't trying to stay up on that wide road, cause I can't let them take my soul. Nah, 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 no. Oh, I can't let them take my soul. Nah, 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 no.
Welcome back to the Urban Perspectives, where we bring you the stories that matter from the voices who lived them. Today, I'm honored to have a powerhouse in the fight for justice join us. MiAngel Cody, founder of the Decarceration Collective law firm and a relentless advocate for criminal justice reform. MiAngel and I have crossed paths in our shared mission to amplify the voices of the unheard. And her dedication to freeing those unjustly incarcerated is truly inspiring. MiAngel, sweetheart, welcome back to the show.
It's an honor to join you, Akbar.
MiAngel, you've been on a mission for a long time, bringing people home. Fighting for justice is where the system has failed, but it didn't just happen overnight. Walk us through what got you here, what inspired you to start the Decarceration Collective. You've also partnered with Brittany Barnett in the Buried Alive project on a lot of this work. How did that partnership come together? And what does it mean to you to be part of a team that's fighting for freedom on both fronts?
It's a great question. I think my journey started, I was a death penalty investigator in New Orleans. And I was 19 going to visit, at that time, all men on death row in Angola Penitentiary in Louisiana.
The infamous Angola.
The infamous Angola. And I thought I was going to be a doctor. I was at Xavier. I wanted to be a doctor. I wanted to have like this comfortable life, doing what I thought was sort of the talented 10th path of Black excellence.
Okay.
And then I started seeing how there was such a need to tell the stories and to memorialize and lift up the voices of people who were behind the wall. Okay. And many of whom were either innocent or over-sentenced. Right. And so my journey started with listening to men on death row tell their stories and trying to understand not only how they got there, because I think a lot of people are interested in how people get to death row, but also how we as a society got there as well.
Okay.
So I consider myself a storyteller first.
Okay.
And I'm interested in like peeling back the curtain at the Wizard of Oz to see what's back there.
Okay.
Who are the people, who's tinkering with it. And I'm very competitive, right? And my mother always used to say, your mouth is either going to get you in trouble or it's going to make your way, because I was always like, why? Why do we have to do it this way?
Okay.
So going up against the government every day, my opposing counsel is the United States of America.
Okay.
I love that. Because I always felt like that's just who I am. Like, you got to explain to me, especially when somebody's life or liberty is at stake. So I changed my, major, changed my path, went to law school, went to a corporate law firm for 2 years and realized that that was not for me because the conversations were just mind-numbingly boring for me. I became a Chicago federal public defender.
How long did you work in the public defender's office?
About 10 years.
Really?
Right.
That's
about
a long
10
time.
years. I was in the bullpen, like in Chicago, I had hundreds of cases. So you start to see trends, right? Like you start to see, I tell people I probably represented over the course of that 10 years, a handful of criminals.
Okay.
I represented a lot of people who were mentally ill.
Okay.
Who were experiencing acute or chronic generational poverty.
Okay.
And a lot of people who had their lives defunded. Their mental health care, their educations, their parental systems were all defunded. And then suddenly, as you know, Akbar, then the United States of America comes and pays very focused attention to them when they're on the other side of the V in an indictment. So that experience being a federal public defender and working with people who couldn't afford a lawyer is what made me understand the importance of fighting for people who didn't have the economic resources to negotiate their way out of prison.
Okay.
And I also realized in that process that there's a Sixth Amendment right to counsel for trial in your first appeal. But particularly for those of us who are living in the aftermath, in the despair of mass incarceration, post-conviction, as you know, you have no right to a lawyer.
Absolutely.
Right? And so there were people who had just their lives were decimated by mass incarceration 20, 30 years ago, but they couldn't get into court with adequate counsel because they couldn't afford it. So I left the federal defender's office to start the Decarceration Collective to fill that gap. To provide post-conviction counsel, habeas, compassionate release counsel to people who couldn't afford it.
Are you working with Eric Adams or any people out of Harvard on this?
No.
Okay, because I've heard them mention this too.
Yeah, it's really important because I think what I found is we've all seen some incremental, and we can talk about this, some incremental changes going forward, with the law.
Yeah.
There's policy shifts, not enough. But even, for example, when we got the First Step Act, the change in compassionate release, there was a press conference and people were clapping and everybody's happy. And then what I found was there were no lawyers to actually represent these people to get back into court to avail themselves of that progress, right? And so I always felt like the press conference was fine, but who's going to stand at the podium in court?
Let me ask you something else. You've seen a lot of different administrations handle the issue of clemency. And I know that you've been intimately involved, both you and your partner, Brittany Barnett. What's your take on what the current administration has done with clemency? And do you think they've done enough or they've done far too little?
I'm going to give you the short answer and then I'll work. All right. The short answer is absolutely not.
Okay.
The longer answer, so at the federal defender's office, I got a call. This is like 2012. I got a call from a woman who said that her high school friend was serving life in prison for drugs, and it was his first conviction, and he got life. There's no parole in the federal system.
Absolutely.
When he was 19. So I'm a young Chicago federal defender on duty. I'm busy. I have court that day. I told her I was going to call her back. Look into the case, and it turns out, against my skepticism, she was absolutely right. He was a teenager, first-time drug offender who got life. Had exhausted all of his court remedies, had gone up to the Supreme Court, lost, and he had been in prison for 23 years. So I said to the director of our office, I want to write a clemency petition for this young man. His name was Reynolds Wintersmith. And of course, the director's like, we've never done clemency petitions before. It's like winning the lottery. Obama's president. You can do it, but kind of do it on your own time.
Okay.
So I spent a year writing that clemency petition, hundreds of pages. I went to the library archives. I told his story. I interviewed his family members. I hand walked that brief over to the post office myself to send it. And then you wait a year and we didn't hear anything. Obama had never granted any clemencies before. And then a year later, we got the call from the White House that Reynolds Wintersmith's petition had been signed by the president. And he was one of the first 8 under Obama to win clemency.
Okay.
We know that, what ultimately happened was Obama created the Clemency Project 2014, somewhere close to 600 people serving life in prison, mostly for drugs, got clemency, and a total of maybe 1,800
Absolutely.
got clemency.
I wasn't in that group.
You were not. And that to me is critique number one, is when we try to scale projects and call them criminal justice, it sometimes becomes too formulaic, right? So people who had gotten, indicted or convicted under the Kingpin statute, not so much, we don't want to spend too much political capital on those cases. And then Brittany and I worked with the Trump administration to win one clemency from that administration.
And that was Helen Johnson?
No, that was Pharrell Scott. Alice Johnson also got clemency from Trump. Brittany and I worked together on Pharrell Scott.
Okay.
And so there, over those 2 administrations, I've seen two things. Under Obama, I think there was a good intention to scale and to do big numbers, but it became too formulaic, right? Mm-hmm. Under Trump, it was far fewer numbers, mm-hmm. and the way forward was a lot more unclear. Mm-hmm. What I've seen under this administration is they're playing the numbers game. Mm-hmm. So you might remember last year how there was this news headline that said Biden commuted the convictions of marijuana offenders.
I remember that all too well.
Right. And then
he put the number out there.
And there's a big number.
Yeah, and no impact.
No impact, because most of these people are at home. And
Absolutely.
So they're getting the news of their clemencies from their couch, mm-hmm. right? So, now we've drifted from actually using the clemency pen to get people out of prison, mm-hmm. to do true decarceration, mm-hmm. to now we just chasing a headline, mm-hmm. right? And so even most recently, last month, that, there were 1,500 people who were commuted. Now, you and I know most of those people were already on home confinement under the CARES
mm-hmm.
Act.
Absolutely.
Right. And so my concern is that is the focus really on clemency, or is the focus on the news headline?
Yeah. I think personally that it's political, and for all of the wrong reasons. Politics can be used to serve a community good. But in this instance, I just think, like you said, they're crunching numbers, and they're trying to, in some regards, leave an undeserved legacy, based upon those numbers.
Right.
That I've really reached out into the urban communities, and, I've released 1,500 people, 1,400 of them, which were already home,
Right.
And we did something on marijuana, but I mean, that was for people that are incarcerated with guys that are serving life sentences, we don't want to hear that you criminalize marijuana for people that weren't on the reservation or whatever the fact might be.
Right.
So it doesn't really impact those that are sitting in the jails.
Right. And I think for me, the question is, how do we address this crisis of accountability? Uh-huh. Right? Because we know it's happening. We've already diagnosed the problem, and it is exactly that. It's disingenuous. Uh-huh. How do we hold lawmakers accountable and say, that's not really what you're doing. Uh-huh. And so stop lying. Uh-huh. Right? Those are the conversations I'm interested in having.
Okay. All right. That's interesting, because when you deal with issues of accountability, at the end of the day, for most of the politicians, it's about running for re-election, and they do this and see which way the wind is blowing. And if the wind is blowing in one direction, that's the direct. So right now, it seems to be moving back towards lock them up and throw away the key. Trump is talking about bringing back stop and frisk, or basically on a national level. It got overturned mm-hmm. in New York with the judge whose name escapes me. He is also talking about the death penalty for narcotic distribution. We know how that impacts. They don't do raids in the suburban America. They do raids in the inner city. So we know the disproportionate impact. What are your thoughts about the incoming administration in regards to criminal justice, and where do you think that takes us?
I think that I get this question a lot. And what I told people the day before the election, there were a lot of people who were just convinced that Kamala was going to win.
I was one of them.
And there were a lot of people who were brokenhearted when she didn't. Mm-hmm. And my response was always brace for impact. Mm-hmm. There was a part of me as an abolitionist lawyer that I wouldn't say happy, but I was completely fine with the fact that people do not get to go back to sleep. Uh-huh. I think if Kamala would have won, people would have gone back to sleep and been like, oh, crisis averted, But those of us who are doing the work know that we are existing in a long state of crisis. Uh-huh. So I'm glad that people don't get to go back to sleep and think that it's okay, because it hasn't been, and it hasn't been for a very long time. I think that we are entering a state of sleep deprivation. Mm-hmm. And when people are deprived of sleep, then they start distrusting what they're seeing.
And
Is it really that bad?
And they hallucinate.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so there's going to be a lot of hallucinations happening. I think that this incoming administration is going to be, I tell people, my work is hostage negotiations.
Okay.
I will negotiate with whoever has my hostages, right? And I don't have the privilege of being partisan. I've seen Democratic administrations disappoint in ways that are just break my heart. So I think that those of us who are really committed to the work have to be prepared and have to have the mettle to negotiate with whoever, because my clients are worth it.
No permanent friends, no permanent enemies, only permanent interests.
Yes, I want the keys. I want them out, And that I get up and do the work regardless of what the weather is. I think some people who call themselves revolutionaries, they want to do the work when it's sunny.
Okay.
And when the conditions are perfect.
Summer soldiers.
Yeah. Right?
Yeah.
And it's like, if it was the summertime, then we wouldn't need the soldiers. It's going to rain. Like, it's raining, right? And so I think we have to just really get used to doing it consistently, regardless of what administration is in office.
You've taken on some incredibly tough cases, including death penalty cases. I know you as a death penalty advocate, even before I knew about you, even before we met. This past summer, there was a case that really sparked the national conversation, Marcelus Williams case in Missouri. Can you share your thoughts on that case?
I would say that the Marcelus Williams case, and I think that the word case doesn't even capture, the Marcelus Williams murder is one of the most perplexing, unsolved murders of 2024.
Okay.
And I say unsolved. Now, we know that he was executed by the state, right? Okay. But we don't fully understand how he was executed because, the prosecutor's office was opposing his execution in the later journey to his death, and the victim's family. Right. And so the PR propaganda machine that is Injustice in America says, well, we have to execute these people because the families need closure. They need justice. Or the prosecutor's office, secured a sound conviction and a sound sentence. But in his case, no one's ever been able to fully explain why he was executed. And I think what his case does is makes us understand we don't really know who is driving the bus here, right? We don't fully, and we have not given it the attention that it deserves to figure that out. If people are being executed when the victim's family and when the prosecutor's office are saying don't, what's driving this? And until we solve that, to me, it's unsolved, right? But it strikes at the core of what you and I know about the system, and that is it worships finality over humanity. There is a critical apathy that I think that we've just normalized. And I think that people find it really hard to fully hold that this is someone who's dying, like who's going to die, And so I think that I consider his murder unsolved.
Let me ask you a question. A long time ago, I read two cases. They were death penalty cases. It was Furman versus Georgia, which I think overturned the death penalty. And then they reinstated, was it Craig versus Alabama? But the question that arose out of that was a disproportionate impact. And they argued that because it was so disproportionate, it was basically unconstitutional. I'm certain that the figure still exists, but why doesn't the argument still exist? Or does the argument still exist?
Because we've normalized the existence. We've become very comfortable with the existence of the faults in the system. And we're just tinkering with the apparatus, right? For example, I am a death penalty abolitionist. I don't believe that the state should be murdering people because it is so disproportionately used against Black and poor people. And because what that does is that it ingrains in us a sense that there are certain lives that matter more, that are worth more.
Okay.
Depending on, I mean, the death knell combination is if you're Black and you murder a white person in the South.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Oh, absolutely.
So
it's just the opposite if you're white and you murder a Black person.
Absolutely. Right.
Okay.
Then you're standing your ground and all the things, absolutely. Right? So, but I think to understand it, and that's just the surface level of analysis. Okay. To really understand it is we at some point in the conversation of justice in America, stopped talking about abolition and we started talking about reform.
Okay.
I am not a criminal justice reform advocate because I don't believe there's ever been criminal justice in America. And so there's nothing to reform. It has not been born yet.
Okay.
And so until we start talking about that, because the language is really important, right? And you and I would never say we are slavery reform advocates or segregation reform advocates. We understand, the goal is always to abolish.
In regard to what you said, Malcolm X may have said it best. You can't stick a knife in my back 12 inches and take it out 6 and say we're making progress.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So
absolutely,
that's reform.
Absolutely. No, it was never for you. No one was ever advocating, let's reform his life sentence. You know what I'm saying? Right. Like, let's be real. And so I think in thinking about Marcelus Williams, I go back to Troy Davis. There were many cases that I worked on in the South, death penalty cases, where people were just okay. We'll try to make it better. We'll tinker with it. Maybe we'll have some outcomes that feel right.
Okay.
I do think that the propaganda machine that I see and go up against every day, it's really good. I think for a while people would say to me, oh, you're a part of the Innocence Project. And I'm like, I respect the work of the Innocence Project. I think it's necessary work, but my clients are guilty. And we need to start having a real conversation in America that isn't just guilt and innocence. It is about punishment, and are we really throwing people away in mass? Because after they're found guilty, then they don't matter anymore.
No, absolutely.
Right. And so I think those are the nuanced conversations that you get to have when you stop just focusing on reform.
Do you remember Lonnie Lanier?
I do.
Okay. Don't tell me she's a mentor.
No, she's not a mentor. She's a hero, though.
A hero, absolutely.
Yeah.
She had a project. It wasn't even a project. She had a position that she was advocating. And you're probably familiar with it, but it was telling the jury basically to, although the evidence may have weighed against a particular defendant, to find them not guilty to begin to balance the scales.
Yes, jury nullification.
Jury nullification, okay. What do you think about that?
I think that jury nullification, we are told as lawyers we can't argue jury nullification.
I know.
I really want more people to be educated about jury nullification.
Okay.
Because I think what happens is so many of the people who I represent in court are afraid to go to trial, because if you do, then you face, as you know, the mandatory minimums. Like you pay the trial tax and you pay heavily. And in order to balance the scales so that more people feel empowered to evoke their constitutional right to a trial, then they have to feel like the jury isn't going to just rubber stamp.
Okay.
So I think for me, jury nullification isn't necessarily about, it's not necessarily, I'm not telling people to violate the law or to not respect the law. It is look at what is the principle here that the law, and we don't talk about principles enough in the law. Do we really believe that the law is designed to put someone in prison for the rest of their life for drug offenses where people didn't die, right? Or, I mean, not to even sound too provocative, but even people who've been convicted of murder in the state system get a parole hearing every now and then. But in the federal system, you don't.
Well, I just want to address that a little bit. I was in jail. I'm only recently released, as you know. I haven't been home 100 days.
We are lucky to have you back.
Yeah, and I'm glad to be back. I was serving a life sentence without parole, plus 50 years. And during the course of my sentence, I met a lot of guys that were from the D.C. area, and they were in there on murders, and some of them were 2 or 3 murders. And after 10 years, they generally went up, and after 30 years, it was considered that their sentence had been served in whole. And every 2 years, in some cases, they went up. Well, in the federal system, I had one of the largest inmate-ran and most successful inmate-ran program in the federal system. They said that I did everything except find a cure for cancer, but I could never move the needle because I couldn't go up for parole. And the apparatus for parole still exists because it exists for prisoners that came in before 87, which is that number being, I won't say decimated, but it's being marginalized because very few people from that period are still alive, But also for the D.C. inmates, they continue to go up. So I watched sometimes flummoxed as some of the guys that I was in there with that had 2 and 3 murders was going up. And some of the nonviolent federal offenders, never went up because they had life with no parole.
Right.
So,
right.
And, it would be my hope, and I don't know what's happening in that regards outside of what I'm doing with my own organization, the Coalition of Formerly Incarcerated Men, in the efforts to bring back parole. But is any, to the best of your knowledge, is any efforts being made along these lines to probably bring parole back in the federal system?
There have been parole advocates for many, many years. And I'm thinking, particularly in D.C., I know Nkechi Taifa and others have really been carrying that flag of second look. What we did see was with compassionate release, which is like a judicial second look, which I think is good legislation. My concern is I've seen the judiciary being reshaped and being slowly dragged to more conservative.
Right. Strong,
right.
Hard right.
Right. And so my concern is that oftentimes we get good at legislation, but we don't necessarily get the judges nationally who are implementing it in compassionate ways. And it shouldn't be that you're more likely to get compassionate release in somewhere like Chicago as opposed to Alabama, right? Depending on where you are. So, because then it's just by coincidence of geography. So I think that a national review would be necessary, but I'm also very, very critical of formulaic approaches. And I wouldn't want a formulaic parole board to just sit, because then people go back to sleep. And I'm always looking at the ways in which, what is going to put people back to sleep again? And so if you get a parole board and they're just rubber stamping, this one yes, this one no, this one took the programs, this one didn't, is the illusion of a solution worse?
Okay. What would you do? Where would your head go in this instance?
My head goes to not just one solution, but a constellation. Okay. So I want to see more judges using compassionate release. There is legislation on the books where the BOP can and should, but does not put people up for review for compassionate release because they see you in prison. They saw what you were doing, right? And so why didn't the director of the Bureau of Prisons nominate some people and say there's a process for that is just not being used? I could see where a parole board would work, particularly to help decarcerate people who've been sentenced to long sentences. And I also want to see a full and robust use of clemency. Okay. So I don't think it's any one. I think it's holistic. The checks and balances. Yeah, it's the checks and balances. And then once we get people out, then we can talk about reentry.
For folks who watch and want to do more, people who hear this interview and want to get involved, what's your advice? How can they support the Decarceration Collective or Buried Alive and start pushing for change in their own communities?
Well, first, I would say that I believe that we're existing in a time in history where people who care really care. Okay. And are engaged in ways that I think are really important. We saw that after the George Floyd protest. Okay. People will lock in and plug in ways that I find I take deep inspiration from. Okay. The place where I want people to go is accountability, right? A lot of money gets raised and people hope and expect that their resources, their engagement will be used and invested in the right ways. And too often I see that it's not. And I've been talking about the nonprofit industrial complex for a long time because I think that it is part of the problem and not part of the solution.
Okay.
And so I really want people to know it's important to support where you see the work being done. It's not enough to talk about it.
In the weeds.
In the weeds, right? And so that's why Brittany and I just said, like, we want to post, like, Jordan, we're going to post the numbers. We're going to get many people out of prison and also demonstrate that we can do it, as Black women often do, with minimal resources, you know? And so I think expecting your engagement to actually reap results is key.
Mm-hmm.
So people can always go on the Decarceration Collective's website, Decarceration Law, and support us that way. You can support the Buried Alive Project. I'm at Lawyer MiAngel on Instagram. Brittany is Brittany K. Barnett on Instagram. People reach out to me. I've taken cases from social media. And so I like that kind of organic engagement, and I welcome it.
Okay. Well, a heartfelt thank you, MiAngel.
Thank you.
Cody, for sharing your insights and unwavering commitments to justice for us today. Her work with Decarceration Collective serves as a powerful reminder of the impact one person can have on challenging the systemic injustice. And in closing, I would say that solutions don't start from the top down. It starts from the bottom up. This is a living example of that start and where it's taking us. Thanks again, sweetheart.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
For those inspired by MiAngel's mission, I encourage you to support our organization dedicated to criminal justice reform and to stay informed about the clemency process. Don't forget you can catch this in every episode of Urban Perspective wherever you listen to podcasts. Subscribe, share it with someone who needs to hear these stories, and let's keep these conversations going. Remember, change starts with us. One voice, one action, one step at a time.
'Cause I can't let them take my soul. Nah, nah.